So the way I like to frame this issue is fairly simply that children are the segment of the population who are most exposed to violence, crime, and abuse. They experience all the same forms of crime, violence, and abuse that adults do, like assault, rape, property crimes of various sorts, exposure to warfare and stuff. But they also experience victimizations that are specific to their status as children, things like neglect, which you heard about, or sexual abuse, which certain kinds of sexual abuse would not be crimes if they involved adults. But this is something that really has not been sufficiently emphasized to the people who organize crime prevention and systems in our society. I just want to give you a little flavor of some of the evidence that shows this to be the case. This is from the National Crime Victimization Survey, shows for youth 12 to 17. They have 2 to 3 times the levels of victimization, aggravated assault, simple assault, rape, robbery, than do the adults in the population. So very high levels. That survey misses a lot of the family violence. Here's data from a national survey of specifically family violence, showing that the children and youth in families are exposed to 5 times more violence within the family than adults are, 3 times more than when you talk about serious, severe kinds of violence. Does raise a very important question. Why? Why are kids so vulnerable? In some ways it seems very intuitive, and nobody sort of doubts it, but I think that social science, criminology, and brain researchers have not really specifically tried to tease out what the main mechanisms are here. I think it's worth just putting out what my speculations are about it. The kids are, on the whole, smaller, less experienced, dependent, have acquired fewer of the conflict resolution strategies that you do to help you avoid being a victim. Teenagers are hit less by their parents than young kids. It's not because they're so much more cooperative, but it's because they figured out how to avoid. We have weak protective norms and sanctions. If I were to hit you, the police would be here very quickly. If a child gets hit by another child, for example, is not likely to involve the same kinds of mechanisms. So the norms, sanctions, and institutions are very different operating when it comes to the protection of children. This is very important. Kids have a lot less choice over whom they associate with than other segments of the population. They don't choose the families that they're born into. They don't choose the neighborhoods where they live. They don't choose the workplace environments so much. I mean, they have to go to school, and they have to rub shoulders with people, all kinds of other kids in those environments, and have very little ability to kind of insulate themselves from. There's a lot more you can say about this, but I just want to lay this out. One of the key problems that I have diagnosed in our response to this problem and our mobilization about violence in the lives of children is that it has been a very fragmented response. We have people who are mobilized about sexual abuse, about bullying, about school crime, about cyberbullying, about physical abuse, kidnapping, so forth. And this is counterproductive. A good comparison is what exists in the area of the crimes that kids commit, what's called the field of juvenile delinquency, which is actually quite integrated and covers all these different kinds of juvenile offenses. But there is no comparable field with regard to juvenile victimization and violence exposure, and I think that is a big part of the problem. Not having such a field underestimates the true scope of the victimization. We talk about just certain elements of it. It obscures the interconnections among these different kinds. It fails to identify the most victimized kids. It creates very serious competition for scarce resources as people go to school principals, for example, with a dating violence prevention program or a sexual abuse prevention program or a bullying prevention program, and they can't do all of them. I think it reduces our policy influence. It results in arbitrary distinctions. I don't have time to go into this, and it ignores children's own perspective. Kids don't think about them in these boxes. They think about people in places that are safe, people in places that are dangerous. And we should have a field that I think is organized much more along this integrative, comprehensive lines that reflects their perspective. And so a big example, I think, of this is, for example, we've been talking about maltreatment. Very few people are aware of the fact that peer victimization, I'll talk a little bit more about this, has consequences on children's development and later outcomes that are as great as parental child maltreatment. This is a longitudinal study that showed that for health problems. And so when we talk about maltreatment, we don't often include peer victimization, but I think it's a very serious oversight. It's not listed on the ACEs inventory, for example. My remedy for this is a concept I call developmental victimology. It tries to unite all of these different kinds of victimization exposure: violence, crime, and abuse. Those are the three categories that I emphasize in a kind of common field of study. And it has sort of various domains: family, peer, community elements to it. So, it covers all the different domains where victimization can occur. And I think it has two important sets of focus. One is about how the risks for various kinds of victimization change over the course of development, and then how the impacts of victimization also change and morph over the course of development. And I don't have time to go into this in a great deal of detail, but just to give you a kind of sense of it, we can talk about how risk changes, family exposure to family member victimization declines as kids get older, exposure to stranger and acquaintance increases. We can also talk about how the seriousness or lethality of violence exposure changes over the course of childhood, with it being particularly high when kids are very young, primarily because of their small size and the developmental immaturity of their physiological structures. And then in teenage years, it becomes very high risk again as they begin to associate with people who use weapons and can cause lethal injuries with those. And then there's gender differences that evolve over the course of development too, so that at younger ages, the gender patterns of victimization are similar for boys and girls, but they diverge as children grow into adolescence. And for example, girls experience more sexual assault, boys experience more homicide. You can also organize the impacts of victimization along a developmental trajectory as well. I've got too much animation in this one, I'm afraid. My finger is going to get sore here. And I don't have time to go into this, but just gives you a sense of how you might structure these things and think about them in a developmental way. And this has not been done very, very frequently. A lot of the literature is simply, focused on some overall impacts at one particular developmental stage. We have an instrument which tries to conceptualize all this, the Juvenile Victimization Questionnaire that captures 52 different kinds of victimization and violence exposures that kids can experience. We've done 4 large national surveys of children with this instrument, getting the information from children themselves from age 10 and older, and from a caregiver for the kids under age 10. We have lots of findings from this research. I mean, the basic one, of course, is the incredible vulnerability of kids to all different kinds of victimization. These are past year victimizations in this national sample. I like to focus on one particular finding, though, that I think has been particularly important for me and the rest of the field, and that has been the recognition that there are certain kids who experience a large number of different kinds of victimizations, and that seems to put them at rather extreme risk for symptoms and other later effects. About 10% of the sample is this group that we call polyvictimized kids. And these are experiencing not just repeated episodes of the same kind of victimization, but a variety of different kinds of victimizations at the hands of different perpetrators over a relatively short period of time, like a period of a year in this graph. One of the things that we find is that these polyvictim kids are the ones who harbor most of the symptoms and psychopathology. When we look at trauma symptoms in these kids, for example, and look at kids who've had simply a single type of victimization or multiple episodes of a single type of victimization. You can see for the maltreatment kids here, the first and second is one, so having the non-victims, those who have relatively low chronicity, those who have high chronicity but no polyvictim, and then you compare them to the polyvictimization group who've had the maltreatment and these other forms of victimization. The psychopathology, the symptom score is much higher for these polyvictim kids, and so it suggests that these are the kids who should be our priority focus for identification and treatment. Some other key developmental findings to come out of our research. Peer victimization is more frequent than adult caregiver victimization and is just as impactful, so the point that I made earlier. And also continuing finding that emotional and psychological abuse by both peers and caregivers has very high impact. For me, that's an important argument for not simply using the term violence in talking about what it is that we're trying to address and what it is that we're trying to prevent. Because although some people have tried to talk about emotional violence or psychological violence, I think a lot of people just don't think about this particular category of adversity. So I like to talk about violence, crime, and abuse in enumerating the range of things that we're trying to emphasize here. I'm going to talk briefly about interventions because I do think that's really where the conversation needs to go. This is a very nice publication and effort by the World Health Organization and Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children to identify from the literature where the evidence-based interventions are and the things that we know about that can most work. They've identified 7. Myself, I've wanted to boil it down even into a more simple formula. I call it peace law. I think that the areas where we really have the most evidence for successful prevention are in parent education, in interventions to pacify and the school environment, and in interventions that make law enforcement more oriented to and sensitive to the needs of children, child victims. Just to sort of go into a little bit more detail about this, there are lots of studies. I'd say this is probably where the research is the deepest and strongest, that show that when you teach parents nonviolent, attachment-promoting child management skills, it reduces their use of violence and psychological coercion and improves their nurture and care of children and results in improvements of all sorts in child outcome. I think some of the key research issues in this area, though, really are that unfortunately, even when they're referred to parenting programs, maybe only a third of those who are referred actually take advantage of them. So we need to know a lot more about how to build programs that engage parents fully, that are adapted to parents' schedule and learning style and culture. And that's where the big challenges is. And the other big challenge is getting men engaged, because they tend to be the least likely to take on to be motivated to acquire these parenting skills, and oftentimes are most lacking in them. In terms of school environment, there are numerous studies that show that a variety of school-based programs at both elementary middle school and high school level can reduce bullying, can reduce sexual assault, can reduce other kinds of victimization. And these programs typically involve teaching in the classroom, doing things to change the school environment, and the kinds of supervision that are provided, and the kinds of leadership that is given by the leaders of the school. The key problem in this area that I see is that we have a lot of these programs that are targeting little parts of this overall spectrum, bullying prevention or dating violence. And what we need are programs that are much more comprehensive in their targeting and that also are built into the core curriculum of our educational system and that complement and integrate with other learning objectives that are very important to the schools, like numeracy and social science and reading and those kinds of things. Unfortunately, I don't think the schools will sustain these kinds of programs unless it can be shown very clearly that these programs promote the other big goals that schools tend to have, and they're being tasked with an awful lot to do these days. Finally, law enforcement. There's a considerable amount of, there's some, not as much research in this area, that when law enforcement becomes more committed, involved, and sensitive to working with children, that it greatly increases the number of referrals that they get and also the outcomes of the children who actually are the subject of interventions. Things like children's advocacy centers and multidisciplinary teams to investigate and respond to children. This is very important. And also, a key element to a lot of these programs with law enforcement is it teaches law enforcement to collaborate with other professions. And I think that's working in a lot of places. I think another thing that's been crucial in the law enforcement area that hasn't been much talked about is the integration of women into roles and as police officers and as prosecutors and as judges. This has been very important in making the justice system more oriented toward children and a more child-friendly environment. So finally, I want to raise an issue that I think is very interesting, very important for people to realize, and the source of, I think, a great deal of both optimism, but also should be more scientific attention. There are a lot of signs that violence against children is declining, both in the United States and elsewhere. It probably has been declining for a long period of time, but the evidence that we have pertains specifically to the last 20 to 25 years. Rates of two kinds of child maltreatment, physical abuse and sexual abuse, have declined very dramatically. And I think it's not surprising. Those are the ones that have gotten the most focus and attention. These are very impressive declines, but there's lots of evidence from other sources about the declines as well. Juvenile homicide victimization has been declining, particularly for teenagers, but also for younger kids as well. The data on kid offending also shows big improvements. And since most of those offenses are against other kids, those are signs that things are getting better. School surveys that measure school victimization have shown very big improvements over the last 20 years or so. And there are indications that other things like exposure to intimate partner violence, I can go through a lot of these slides, but I only brought a sampling of them. It's a very encouraging trend. And unfortunately, I don't think we know what all the factors are that are contributing to it. I can tell you what some of the my speculation is about it if we have time in the question or answer period. Just to summarize, your presence here and all the research that we've seen and much more that, it shows that there's just an enormous mobilization that is taking place about this problem. It's very encouraging, I think, to see how much is happening at all scientific levels on this topic. There are, and this was not true when I was first working in this field back in the 1980s, there are a lot of evidence-based programs to address these problems, and we need to learn about them and develop them further and disseminate them as well as we can. And we have reason to think that those programs and other things connected to our social environment are making a difference. And so we're working with the tide of social change, I think, on this. And that's encouraging. We should be able to feel optimistic and emboldened by that. Where I think we need to focus particularly is in expanding participation of social institutions in this violence prevention effort, and particularly adopting the kinds of programs that I've been talking about here. And particularly, I would focus on schools and primary care settings. There's a lot that we can do to make it easier for them to get involved in both screening for these problems and helping to prevent them. And I think we then also need, as I said, to develop these programs more, make them more comprehensive, use technology to better advantage, to make them acceptable, and also to get as many vulnerable children and their families involved as possible. All right. So with that, do you want to is there time for questions, or should we? 2 minutes. All right. If you have something urgent you would like me to talk about, or maybe your stomachs are. All right. Well, I will be back in the afternoon, and if you have something you want to ask, you can ask me then. But thank you.